It is my sincere delight to introduce Natalie Reed, the blogger who got her most famous start on Skepchick and since founded Queereka, a network of skeptical blogs specific to LGBTQ issues, and who currently blogs there and on Freethought Blogs network. One of my absolute favorite bloggers. And from the looks of things, she has something absolutely awesome about to unfold for us. So, enjoy.
Hey everyone, I apologize for the fact that the title was hanging out all through lunch, which sort of ruins the punch, but lots of bonus points to anybody who got the Wonder Woman reference there. Anyway, so me and Anya were invited to speak about gender issues at this conference for this workshop this afternoon. That's an extremely broad topic, so it was sort of a little bit hard to figure out exactly what to say about gender issues, since that's about 1,288 different topics right there. But I decided that maybe it might be good to talk a little bit about what gender actually is and what we mean by that. Anyway, the working definitions that I'm going with lately have been that sex is the biological phenomena, and that gender, by contrast, is sociocultural, psychological, and most importantly, and I think a bit neglected, is a semiotic phenomena. Semiotics is sort of signs or signifiers, things that represent one thing but aren't actually that thing. So sort of like language would be a semiotic system, or exit signs, or the little things on washrooms. Those are all semiotics. The sort of classic definition that you'll often come across in social justice circles or little transgender 101 things that you find on the internet is that sex is between your legs and gender is between your ears. I always found that to be a rather inadequate explanation. Because I find that gender is, or sex isn't strictly genital. It's also secondary sexual characteristics, it's hormonal, it's chromosomal, it's can also be neurobiological. And neurobiological is between your ears, right? That's your brain. So it's, you can't just split it up into brain versus whatever's in your pants. Sorry. And lately, related to that gender between your legs, or gender between your ears, sex between your legs thing, is this guy here. He's the genderbread person. You might have seen him around the internet a lot lately. This does a really good job on a really basic level of getting across a lot of what we mean when we're talking about gender identity or gender expression to explain trans identities or intersex identities or queer identities. But my notes here just sort of say genderbread person wrong. This doesn't actually sum anything up. There's a lot about, as I was saying, neurobiology that is in fact sex. It's possible in animals, or at least in mammals, to induce all kinds of sexually distinct behaviors or attractions through things like fetal or infant hormones. You can, for example, get male rats or male guinea pigs to exhibit attraction to other male rats and other male guinea pigs by tweaking their hormonal development at certain key stages in their development of their neural systems. There's also this thing called, I forget the word, lordosis behavior. This is a cat exhibiting lordosis behavior. That's it's a thing that you see in mammals where the females sort of arch up their spines. And this is the least filthy picture I could get for lordosis, just for the record, where cats will sort of arch up their spines and angle up their hips, or mammals, female mammals, in order to facilitate sex and pregnancy. You can also get animals or mammals to do this, ones that are anatomically male and otherwise indistinguishable from other male mammals, to exhibit this same behavior by inducing little tweaks in hormones at certain key stages. So a lot of what we consider the sexual behavioral differences or psychological differences, or even differences of identity, can in fact be neurobiological, and even to the point where we can manipulate it by manipulating neurobiology. So clearly, sex as a biological phenomenon is not strictly anatomical, but can also be neurological and related to neural systems. This here is one of my favorite things for explaining how sex operates in mammals versus other kinds of critters. This is a bilaterally gynandromorphic chicken. Now in birds, sexual differentiation is purely chromosomal, purely genetic. So when you get a bilateral chimera, which has the XX chromosomes on one side and the X0 chromosomes on the other, you end up with a hen rooster split right down the middle. But this can't ever actually happen in human beings because our sexual differentiation is not purely chromosomal. So when people say that a transgender person or transsexual person is scientifically male or scientifically female, that doesn't actually hold because the genetic differentiation isn't the only solid working definition. Anyway, coming back to our genderbread guy here, we've also got this idea of gender identity. And I actually sort of bought this for a long time, this idea of gender identity as being the key distinction between what is a man and what isn't, what is a woman and what isn't. But I find that really what we're talking about with gender identity, we don't really tend to even know. We have this idea of identifies as being sort of the universal distinction there. But what does that actually mean? And sorry, I'm a little bit nervous for some reason. So it sort of seems like a way of maintaining a gender essentialism of men are men and women are women, and that's sort of a distinct, totally binary, solid thing that holds in all circumstances. But without having to go along with actually having any strict definition. There's other kinds of essentialism, like biological essentialism, where male is XY and female is XX. And social essentialism, where being raised or designated as one sex or the other, that's what makes the essentialism. But then we've got this other kind of essentialism where we don't even have a definition anymore. So it also doesn't work. Then finally, we could also, if we were to look at those scientific instances of neurobiological differences being imposed or manipulated in mammals, we could then say that maybe transsexuality is a sort of a female brain in a male body or a male brain in a female body. But also, though, that doesn't seem to actually add up, and our evidence doesn't actually seem to support that. We end up with another oversimplification that certainly doesn't actually explain the full range of diversity of gender that we see exhibited in trans populations. In fact, within any given transgender person, we might see the same exact diversity of gender that we see within cis people. So you can end up with a trans woman who's very feminine, very sort of stereotypically female and girly. You can also end up with a trans woman who's very butch, very macho. And same with trans men. You can have gay, feminine, effeminate, sort of girly trans men, as well as very stereotypically masculine trans men. So clearly even this idea of a female brain being tweaked in a certain way to have a sort of female neurological design still doesn't end up quite representing what that full range of gender actually means. It still ends up being a really complex sort of personal tapestry. And so I've ended up thinking about this idea of gender as semiotics. So gender is sort of how we're saying things about ourselves, whereas sex is sort of what we're saying. That ends up, sort of the trouble with that, though, is it ends up being a sociocultural, semiotic, and psychological system. And we can't end up using hard science exactly to talk about gender, which makes things a lot harder than they would otherwise be. To help explain a bit about what I mean by gender as semiotics, we've got this sort of eschatological theme here at the conference. There's my little eschatology, nice little mushroom war from Adventure Time. So Alan Dove was talking on Friday night about eschatologies as being similar to thought experiments, where we sort of imagine a hypothetical way that our society could end up and use that to contrast the society that we actually have and illustrate some of the aspects of our current situation. I'm finding that thought experiments, in so much as they're used to illustrate a lot of our current biases or current assumptions about our society, can end up containing a lot of the assumptions that we currently have about our society. For instance, we often will talk about this hypothetical post-racial society that we'll end up in, where all of a sudden everybody is just everybody and we all no longer see race, and that we end up using as a guideline for how we politically address the question of race. But that often shows a sort of inherent bias towards the question, where we end up delegitimizing the actual impact that race has for the people who have to deal with that as a constant socio-political force in their lives. And there's this friend of mine named Jessica Luther, who's she's West Indian Black and feminist activist from Texas. She had this great hashtag on Twitter recently, which was liberal thought experiments. And so it's things like, you know, if you didn't give that word so much power, you know, it really wouldn't insult you as much, or things like that. And my favorite of the various insulting, patronizing liberal thought experiments is, of course, the idea of the gender-free utopia, where at some point in the future, all of a sudden we'll no longer have genders and we'll all just wear what we want to wear and sleep with who we want to sleep with, and you know, we won't have to worry about any of that anymore. There's the gender-free dystopia right there. Oftentimes, this hypothetical is used to back up some very patronizing claims that I get from cisgender people, such as, if there were no imposed gender roles, then nobody would ever need the transition. This can also go into condescending statements used to pressure people away from gender transition, such as, for example, why don't you just accept yourself? I mean, we don't encourage people to get cosmetic surgeries over and over. We don't enable eating disorders. So why don't you just learn to live at home in your own body? But oh yeah, and of course, a lot of these people called TERFs, or trans exclusionist radical feminists. They have this idea that trans women are sort of the handmaidens of the patriarchy. And it's often the idea here is trans women are reinforcing patriarchal gender roles. Because if I'm feminine, then I must be a woman, and rah, rah, rah. Those are sort of annoying. So the thing, though, is that I think that this gender-free utopia, it can't actually occur. Not any more than we could, for instance, have a language-free society. Whenever we end up with two people who are together, interacting interpersonally, they develop language, they develop semiotic systems. It's sort of inevitable. Two people who live together on a deserted island, one will find a way to indicate to the other that there's a tiger that lives in the center of the island, and he's going to try to find a way to do that without needing the tiger to actually be there, which would be bad. So he draws the tiger, or says grr, something like that. And so, sort of related to that, so long as we ended up with any social circumstance where human beings have any sexual differences at all, we're going to try to find ways to express, understand, articulate, and perhaps ultimately codify those sexual differences. I'm sort of wondering what like this sort of gender-free utopia, dystopia would actually look like, aside from the sort of cripplingly monotonous version that I sort of presented up there. I had a friend, oh yeah. So these two people here are designated female at birth, and they both identify as agender, or neutre, meaning that they claim to not actually have a gender expression or gender identity. But if we were to imagine those exact same clothes and hairstyles on somebody who was designated male at birth and had a body type which is read as male, we would end up thinking of them as simply male. So what we're actually seeing here is, in fact, a gender expression. It just happens to be a masculine gender expression. But because of things like normativity, where any privileged group within a society is treated or assumed as the default, we end up often looking at masculine genders and sort of just assuming that they're non-gender. Actually, just yesterday I was meeting with a trans guy at a cafe, and he was talking about how he sort of feels like he's more cis than his partner, and his partner is designated male at birth and has like dyed pink hair and sort of a lot of jewelry and sort of gendered clothing. Whereas the trans guy that I was meeting with, he sort of dresses down. He's a little bit sort of gay and femme, but he doesn't dress ostentatiously. And that sort of suggests how, because femininity is perceived as more gendered, than masculinity, it takes a lot more for somebody who's been designated male to actually appear androgynous. See, this person here would be thought of as an androgyne, but clearly the presentation is far, far more feminine and deviating from expectations than what we were seeing on the previous people. And so a lot of this supposedly gender-free utopia that we're imagining, where everybody sort of dresses the same and simply are who they are, that's actually just sort of a monotonously masculine society. I also find that, well, actually as another, oops, I'm actually missing a slide apparently. We can just look at that really pretty person for a little while. So if we were to imagine like a sort of a post-apocalyptic scenario where we ended up within a sort of an island where in order for humanity to survive, we've got this batch of 20 XX eggs and we parthenogenetically clone them over and over and over again. We would sort of think, well, this monosexed all-lady island, the themysciran I was talking about earlier, we could sort of think, well, this is a monosex situation, so gender wouldn't happen. But as long as it wasn't all the exact same strand of DNA, there would be differences between the different people on this island, regardless of whether they're all female. So there might be differences in anatomy that's considered erogenous, such as their breast size or hip width, and also differences in what they actually desire, what kind of sex they like, what kind of bodies they're attracted to. In order for their society to actually function and play out, they would probably need to have sort of ways of communicating that to one another. I was actually thinking just this morning that if sort of the actual anatomical differences between human beings were enough, then we never would have actually evolved distinctions in how we dress in the first place in terms of gender. If the actual immediate anatomical distinctions between male and female were in themselves sufficient for describing what we mean by gender and sex, then why would we ever have needed people to wear a dress versus a pair of jeans in the first place? Anyway, and also I find that sort of situations, sort of monosex, all male or all female communities or situations where gender ends up occurring anyway, we can already observe that in our real life and in our history. This right here is an example of hanky flagging. This was a system developed by gay men around the 70s where they would wear differently colored hankies in their back pockets. If they wore it on the left side, that would indicate that they're top or dom in the sexual role or act that they're seeking out. And if they had in the other pocket, it would mean that they were seeking out to play the supposedly submissive or supposedly feminine coded act or role. Different colors would designate different things like, black being into bondage or other really dirty things that I don't know whether I'm allowed to talk about. And I was sort of thinking that these hanky flag codes are actually sort of examples of sort of miniature microgenders that are occurring within a monosexual community. That each of those different designations, the system as a whole is sort of already a system of describing certain distinctions in what kind of sexual behaviors they wish to engage in. And so that's sort of a gendered system in and of itself occurring within a community that is entirely male. We can also see this within all female communities. This is finger flagging, which is something that evolved from the hanky code. And it's sort of the same thing, but you do with nail polish for femme-identified lesbians, or queer women in general, not just lesbians. And I think that a lot of the terms and concepts that occur in queer communities, such as butch versus femme, which are terms that I've used a lot, actually, or top and bottom, dominant and submissive, daddy, bear, cub, twink, stone, lipstick, lesbian, etc. Like those are all, in and of themselves, sort of miniature little genders. The thing that I find interesting about this is that it can sort of impact how, I think that was supposed to come later, it can actually impact how gender dynamics play out for all of us, not simply within queer communities. The thing is that it's not just the obvious interactions that end up having gender differences when we understand gender as being more complex than simply male versus female or between your legs versus between your ears. All of us have a gender, and if we understand gender distinctions as being anything that pertains to any attempt to communicate sexual difference of any kind, be it anatomical or in terms of desire or in terms of relationship to one's body and anatomy, we end up, any given interaction between any two individuals is going to have a gender dynamic. For instance, there's a thing called femphobia, which is a concept to describe how that which is perceived as feminine is understood as inherently weaker or more frivolous or more superficial or more artificial, less natural, less pragmatic than masculinity. This boy here playing with dolls, he's a lot more likely to get bullied than this girl with a skateboard. So if we end up with something like femphobia, which is a form of misogyny, since femininity sort of just means that which is coded as woman-like or pertaining to women, that can sort of, if misogyny can extend beyond simply those who are designated as women via things like femphobia, then we end up with gender-based oppressions and gender dynamics being applicable in any two given situations. For instance, an alpha male and his dude bro wingman, that there would be itself a power imbalance in terms of gender. And consequently, I don't think it's safe to really regard gender as sort of a unidirectional question. It doesn't simply happen from top down in terms of men versus women or cis versus trans or straight versus queer. It's a sort of constant, omnipresent, multi-directional process. And as such, none of us can actually afford to really ignore it. Thanks. Oh.
I was thinking, my shirt, does it look butch? No. It was appropriate for today.
I think it's androgynous.
Okay.
Got peach, lavender, blue. It's nice.
We actually met online in the Pride Parade.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
helped us with stuff. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Yeah. One of the things that is really great for me at CFI is how much we're involved with LGBTQ rights. We worked with the GSA Coalition, which I mentioned last night, and tomorrow is the protest of the Ugandan anti-homosexual bill, which I'm hoping all of you, some of you, please come to that at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at the Ugandan High Commission. It's Coburg Street.
Details can be found on Facebook.
Yes, there's, yeah, or you can talk to me or Anya. We're gonna there might be some media there. Anyway, sorry to take away from, but with activists, sometimes things happen that we have to just to move on. So I'm just going to read this. At CFI Canada, we are committed to equality and social justice. To that effect, when we realize that someone is particularly effective at bringing those issues to the attention of the public, and especially our communities, we would like to recognize that. So Natalie Reed has been instrumental in pointing out important issues surrounding feminist, queer, and trans issues. Her writing has served to hold up a mirror to our own communities and highlight areas where even we can improve. For that, CFI Canada would like to award Natalie Reed our first Canadian Social Justice Blogger Award. and this prize of $150. Thank you, Natalie.